The most dangerous weapon the US Army ever used in the Hürtgen Forest wasn't a rifle, wasn't artillery, and wasn't a bomb. It was a cheap, wooden match, burning for barely 3 seconds, that brought down an entire elite Nazi sniper network in a way no military doctrine could explain. If you stay until the end of this story, you won't just learn what happened, you'll understand why those highly trained soldiers reacted exactly the way their hunter expected them to, and why a fleeting flicker of light was enough to change the fate of the entire forest. And if you love stories where intellect beats firepower, where a simple idea shatters a whole system of war, subscribe to History War right now, because here, battles aren't told through gunfire, but through the way humans think when facing death. In the Hürtgen Forest, the most dangerous thing wasn't a gun, wasn't a bullet, wasn't a bayonet. It was a cheap wooden match, something that, if placed on a dinner table, would be worth only a few cents, and if held in your hand, would weigh no more than a sigh. But that brief light, lasting less than 3 seconds, shattered a sniper doctrine the German military had spent years perfecting, leading dozens of elite marksmen to die in a way they'd never been trained to counter. The irony? No one in the Hürtgen died because of fire. They died because of reflex. War is used to noise. Cannons, bombs, the roar of engines, black smoke ripping through the sky. But here, in the dark, damp forest, war unfolded in silence. So silent that the snap of a dry twig could mean death. So silent that people began fearing the sound of their own breath. And in that setting, a small, unnatural light appeared. Not to guide, not to warm, but to draw something else out. Instinct. Why would such a small light kill elite snipers? Why couldn't soldiers trained to wait for hours in freezing cold to stare down death without blinking, adapt? And why has this story almost disappeared from official history, as if it's too uncomfortable to remember? Those questions lead us to a name few people know. A soldier who was never famous, never had a statue, never became a legend in textbooks. William Ashworth. Ashworth wasn't the kind of sharpshooter celebrated in speeches. He didn't have a decorated record, no iconic photo posing with a rifle. But in the Hürtgen Forest, Ashworth achieved what artillery, airstrikes, and frontal assaults had all failed to do. He made the enemy reveal themselves, forced them to betray the very survival instincts they'd been trained to master. The matchstick wasn't Ashworth's weapon. It was a question, and that question made the human brain answer before reason had time to intervene. Picture this. You're lying in a cramped sniper hole, back pressed to the cold earth, eye locked to the scope. You've been taught that light is the enemy. Light means exposure. But then, in the suffocating darkness, a tiny flame flares. Your brain doesn't ask for permission. It reacts. Your pupils shrink. Your neck turns toward the light. Your shoulder twitches. A small, almost invisible laboratory, where every spark was an experiment, every reaction a data point, and every death a conclusion. History usually likes to talk about grand battles, blazing offensives. But here, history was written in movements so small, no one thought they were worth recording. And to understand how a single matchstick could do what an entire division could not, we must go back to the very place that allowed this paradox to exist. A forest that didn't just hide people, but warped their senses. A place that didn't just slow footsteps, but shattered the way the human brain perceives the world. The Hürtgen Forest wasn't just a setting, it was a system, a slow, grinding machine of death, where every mistake was magnified and even the smallest reflex could become a death sentence. The Hürtgen Forest was unlike any battlefield American soldiers had ever stepped into before. It wasn't loud, it wasn't open, it didn't allow for sweeping offensives or orderly formations. It closed in like a giant trap, where every sound was swallowed by thick moss and damp tree trunks, where even daylight fractured into shards and scattered across the muddy ground. In this place, direction wasn't a stable concept. One wrong step could lead you right back to where you started. A shallow creek that seemed harmless could mark the boundary between life and death. No one moved through the Hürtgen Forest. They were gradually swallowed by it. Death in the forest didn't come in bursts of violence. It came by erosion. It wore down nerves before it wore down bodies. Fog hung like a permanent curtain, making every distance feel uncertain. A figure just 10 meters away could blur into a shadow against the bark. Everything stood still, but that stillness itself felt like surveillance. You didn't know where you were being watched from. You just knew that if you moved, the forest wouldn't forgive you. For the Germans, the Hurtgen wasn't terrain. It was an ally. They didn't need to control every patch of ground, they controlled the behavior of their enemies. Firing holes were dug low, just enough for a body to lie flat. Scope slits were so narrow they offered only a single angle of view. No sniper operated alone. They were part of a crisscrossing network of observation where a single mistake by an American soldier would instantly be picked up by multiple sets of eyes. Light discipline was treated like gospel. No lighters, no smoking, no metal reflections. In the forest, light wasn't a tool, it was a death sentence. The Americans entered this space with a completely different mindset. They were used to mobile warfare, overwhelming firepower, and seeing the enemy before pulling the trigger. But in the Hurtgen, no one saw anyone. Only bullets came from nowhere. People dropped before they could even understand what had happened. Slowly, a strange kind of psychology set in. If something moved, it died, but if it didn't move, it might die even faster. Stillness was no longer safety. It became a haunting state of suspension. Soldiers began to doubt their own survival instincts. The forest distorted every familiar rule. Sound didn't travel as expected. A gunshot could echo as if from behind, even when the shooter was right ahead. Bullets didn't fly straight. They were deflected by wet wood and broken grain. Even death didn't happen clearly. Many were shot without knowing where the bullet came from. Just a sudden chill in the body before collapsing into silence. No shouts of victory, no clear moments of triumph, just disappearance. In that space, the forest became a closed system. It took in human presence and output confusion. Every footstep was a signal, every cough a confession. The Germans didn't have to hunt American soldiers, they just had to wait. Wait for them to reveal themselves through emotion, a sound, or a lapse in patience. The forest did the rest. The cruelest part, the forest didn't allow for quick learning. Lessons here were paid for in lives, and not everyone understood why their comrades had died. There were no clear rules to pass down, only whispers. Don't walk fast, don't stand still, don't stare too long, don't turn your head too suddenly. These contradictory orders layered over one another, slowly paralyzing decision-making. Soldiers no longer fought with tactics, but with gut feelings. And gut feelings in the Hürtgen Forest were the easiest thing to mislead. That's why the forest didn't just kill with bullets, it killed with mental exhaustion. It shattered the ability to trust oneself. When a soldier no longer believes his actions can lead to predictable outcomes, he begins to withdraw, shrinking, waiting. But waiting in the Hürtgen Forest meant giving up initiative. That's when the sniper network was most effective. In that bleak picture, it's easy to believe that only greater firepower, more men, or better technology could break the stalemate. But the Hürtgen Forest proved the opposite. It neutralized all noise, all brute force. It left only a bare confrontation between human reflex and environment. And in that confrontation, the one who understood how the environment shaped behavior held absolute advantage. In a place that seemed to offer no room for innovation, a new kind of thinking began to emerge, not from a command center, not from a training manual, but from one individual who saw the forest as a living organism. Someone who didn't try to defeat it, but listened to it. Someone who didn't ask how to shoot better in the dark, but asked why people react the same way when placed in that darkness. And from the Hürtgen Forest, from what seemed like a perfect killing machine, a new path of thought was born, tied to the name William Ashworth. A man who didn't hunt targets, but hunted the reflexes that made those targets impossible to hide. William Ashworth didn't grow up dreaming of becoming a hero. His childhood passed in the gray valleys of Kentucky, where coal mines dug into the earth like scars that never healed. Their accidents weren't called tragedies, they were just part of life. People survived not by strength, but by noticing the smallest signs. The creak of wood before a collapse, the strange scent of gas before an explosion, the unnatural silence before disaster. Ashworth learned to observe early, not out of curiosity, but because not observing could mean death. Once, as a teenager, he saw a seasoned miner walk into a familiar tunnel and never come back out. There was no explosion, no warning, just one seemingly harmless decision. From that day on, Ashworth understood that danger rarely announces itself with drama. It hides in the ordinary and waits for people to respond by habit. What kills isn't the event, it's the reflex to the event. When war brought Ashworth to Europe, he carried that perspective with him like a quiet form of armor. While others focused on marksmanship, precision, turning their bodies into cold machines, Ashworth observed people. He watched how his fellow soldiers tensed up during long silences. He noticed how the enemy gave themselves away in moments that seemed too small to matter. He didn't place blind faith in written rules. He believed in repeated behavior, how humans act when placed in the same situation again and again. In the Hürtgen Forest, that difference became clear. Other snipers asked how to see better, shoot faster, or remain hidden longer. Ashworth quietly asked a different question. What makes a person have to move? What forces them to react, even when reason tells them to stay still? He realized that a perfect shot was the end result, but reflex was the beginning. And if you could control the beginning, the result would take care of itself. Ashworth didn't hunt targets in the usual sense. He didn't track individuals. He hunted patterns. He noticed that no matter how strict the discipline, humans have biological limits that cannot be overcome. Eyes will always seek light in darkness. The brain will always try to fill in missing information. When we don't understand what's happening, we unconsciously create an action to confirm reality. That action may be small, but in the Hürtgen Forest, the smallest movement could be punished. There were nights when Ashworth lay still for hours, not to wait for a silhouette to appear, but to listen to the forest's breathing. He realized the forest wasn't completely silent. It had rhythms, wind brushing through leaves, water seeping into the soil, insects vanishing at the hint of an intruder. Within those rhythms, a human response always sounded out of place. And that dissonance was what he could exploit. Ashworth also understood something even more important. If a tactic can be learned quickly, it can die quickly. If an action is too complex, it can't be repeated under stress. So he didn't seek elaborate tricks. He searched for a test so simple people would think it meaningless. A test not meant to kill instantly, but to force the enemy into a choice. And in war, forcing your enemy to choose is often more dangerous than any bullet. The match came to Ashworth's mind not as a weapon, but as an open question. It was small, cheap, silent. But in total darkness, it was an event that couldn't be ignored. He understood that light doesn't just trigger the eyes, it sets off a chain of neural responses, deeper and older than thought. Humans turn toward light not out of curiosity, but because the brain treats it as vital information. To not check the light is to leave a potential threat unconfirmed. Ashworth didn't rush. He waited until every factor aligned, until the forest was dark enough for the light to shock, until the tension had built up long enough that reflex would override discipline, until the enemy had become used to waiting in silence, believing that silence itself was safe differently than any other in the Hürtgen Forest. The fog hung low, heavy like a damp dust clinging to the skin. The dim light of dawn wasn't enough to pierce the darkness beneath the canopy. It only made it murkier, harder to read. In that space, everything seemed still, yet everything was pulled tight like a string on a bow. The soldiers were used to waiting, used to silence so long that their bodies began to forget what time was supposed to feel like. Ashworth wasn't in a position where you'd expect a sniper to be. He didn't choose a good vantage point, nor a high one. His real location was hidden, not meant to observe targets directly, but to watch for the smallest shifts in space. A decoy position was prepared more meticulously, convincing enough that anyone who spotted it would believe it needed to be monitored. These two positions weren't for shooting, they were for reading reflexes. The first match wasn't struck with any expectation of victory. It carried a colder kind of curiosity. Ashworth didn't light it to lure the enemy into firing at the glow, as people might assume. He lit it to measure how the forest would react, to measure how people would respond when an unfamiliar element disrupted the fragile balance of darkness. In war, measurement is often, and the fastest way to fill it is through reaction. Ashworth didn't watch the flame, he watched what happened after the flame. A movement so small it would go unnoticed unless you were waiting for it. A shift in the way a shadow fell, a scope twitching just a few centimeters, a breath held too long finally escaping. No return fire came in response to the light, but something more important did. Confirmation that reflex existed, and that it was stronger than discipline. Ashworth's first shot wasn't a moment of celebration. It happened later, cold, precise, like a mechanical step. The target didn't die because of the match. He died because of the moment he instinctively turned his head. Ashworth didn't see it as a win. He saw it as proof that the system was working exactly as he had predicted. That light truly triggered a sequence of unstoppable human behaviors, and that those behaviors could be exploited. What mattered most was that Ashworth didn't stop. If he had, it would have just been a clever trick that worked once, but he knew that one time meant nothing in war. Value came from repeatability. The second and third matches were struck in different places, at different intervals. No consistent rhythm, no predictable pattern. Each strike was a new test, forcing the enemy to face the same question, but in slightly different contexts. What gradually became clear wasn't the enemy's foolishness, but their helplessness in the face of their own biology. No matter how well trained, no matter how aware they were that the light could be a trap, their bodies reacted before their minds could intervene. And each time they did, the sniper network built on the premise of absolute stillness exposed another tiny weakness. Ashworth didn't need to find each man. He just had to create enough conditions for the system to tremble on its own. From that moment on, the match was no longer just an object. It became a signal. The light wasn't just light. It became input. The human response was the output. And between input and output, Ashworth began to see a structure that could be exploited, adjusted, optimized. He no longer thought in terms of individual shots. He thought in sequences, in how one small action could trigger a chain of reactions rippling through the forest like electricity running through a hidden circuit. The Hürtgen Forest, once a chaotic and random space, began to take shape in Ashworth's mind as a complex circuit board. Each human was a connection point. Each reflex, a pulse. Light was the switch, and if you flipped the switch at the right place at the right time, the whole circuit would light up in ways no one inside it could control. Ashworth understood he didn't need to shoot better. He needed to turn the environment into a system that forced people to expose themselves. When the first match went out, it didn't leave the same darkness as before. It left behind a new understanding that the forest was no longer just a place to hide the enemy, but a tool to make the enemy behave predictably. And from that realization, Ashworth moved into the next phase. No more isolated experiments, no more simple questions. He began turning the entire forest into a living circuit, where each tiny flicker of light could shake the foundations of an entire doctrine. After the first few matchsticks, Ashworth no longer saw the Hürtgen Forest as a space for hiding or attacking. In his eyes, it began to resemble a closed system, where every element was connected by invisible relationships. A movement here would trigger a reaction over there. A small signal, if placed precisely, could ripple through multiple people without ever targeting them directly. The forest was no longer a backdrop, it was a conduit. Ashworth began thinking more like an engineer than a marksman. He broke the experience down into simple components. There was input, output, and feedback. The input was light, brief and small, just enough to stimulate the nervous system. The output was a reaction, subtle but always present, and the feedback loop was how that reaction altered the behavior of others nearby, forcing the entire network to adjust. He didn't need to see individual faces. He just needed to observe the system's movement. The matches were no longer lit at random. They were placed at what Ashworth called tension nodes. These were zones where the German sniper network overlapped most densely, places where multiple lines of sight intersected, where a single soldier's reflex could be subconsciously picked up by others. When a light appeared there, it didn't just force one person to react. It forced the whole group to wonder. Have we just been seen? Ashworth understood that fear doesn't spread through logic. It spreads through uncertainty. When a sniper saw the man next to him twitch after a flash of light, he didn't need the full picture. His brain filled in the blanks with the worst-case scenario. And in the Hürtgen Forest, worst-case scenarios tended to be right. So one person's reflex became group movement. A tilt of the head triggered posture shifts. A sharp breath changed the entire team's rhythm. Ashworth wasn't hunting people. He was hunting the moment the system fell out of balance. When a network is built on absolute stillness, any motion is a betrayal of principle. And that betrayal never happens in isolation. It triggers a chain of adjustments, like an electrical current running through an overloaded circuit. Ashworth only needed to watch the current to locate the wire. What made this strategy terrifying wasn't how many people were shot. It was the feeling of being manipulated. The Germans slowly realized they were no longer responding out of will. They were reacting to signals they couldn't control. A light flickered, and even if they knew it might be a trap, their eyes still contracted. Their necks still turned. And that moment of involuntary reaction felt like a deeper violation than any direct assault. Ashworth also knew that if he repeated the same rhythm, the system would learn. So he changed the intensity, the position, the timing between signals. Sometimes he lit matches in rapid succession, stretching nerves to the point of exhaustion. Other times, hours passed in complete silence, making the next flicker of light hit like a punch. He denied the enemy a rhythm to hold on to. No habits could form, only fatigue, and the growing fear that the next reflex might be the fatal one. Gradually, the Hürtgen Forest became a living network of signals. The light didn't have to appear near a target to be effective. It only had to appear within the system. A flicker on the left could make a sniper on the right shift position because he believed the network was under probe. Ashworth didn't need to aim at him directly. He just needed to understand how fear moved through invisible threads. There were days when Ashworth barely fired a shot. He just observed how the enemy responded to the absence of signals, watched the tightening of groups, the stiffening of bodies, the fatigue building in every tiny movement. He realized the system didn't just react to light, it reacted to the lack of it. Once they became used to being tested, the absence of a test became its own form of threat. The brain began inventing signals, doubting silence itself. In that moment, the forest stopped being a battlefield between two sides. It became a space where one side forced the other to face itself. Ashworth didn't need to impose a tempo, the system created its own, and that tempo drifted further from optimal human performance. Reflexes slowed, decisions grew hesitant, bodies wore down, every small factor compounded, weakening the discipline that the German sniper network relied on to survive. But Ashworth also saw a limit. No system stays static under pressure forever. The enemy would adapt, and if that adaptation happened under stable conditions, it could render his strategy ineffective. So he needed a new variable, something to break any emerging pattern. A change in the environment strong enough to force both sides to reinterpret the world around them. That variable came in the form of fog. Not the usual thin mist, but thick, dense waves that melted the Hürtgen Forest into a formless gray mass. In that fog, light no longer behaved as before. Reflexes no longer triggered the same outcomes. The electrical circuit Ashworth had been reading and manipulating began to change its properties. And in that transformation, a new phase of the confrontation was born. One where the match no longer just triggered reflexes, but forced the entire doctrine to evolve in order to survive. The fog rolled into the Hürtgen Forest without warning. It didn't arrive like ordinary weather, it came like an erasure. Familiar shapes melted away, distance lost meaning. What was once vague became completely indistinguishable. Tree trunks were no longer landmarks. The direction of the wind no longer offered guidance. Even sound was swallowed before it could fully take form. In this fog, the forest ceased to be what it had been. It became a dense mass of uncertainty. To most, fog is a sniper's enemy. It obscures vision, distorts light, renders calculations useless. But to Ashworth, the fog was a multiplier. It didn't cancel his strategy. It amplified what that strategy aimed for: reflex. When the eyes could no longer be trusted, the brain leaned harder on instinct. And instinct under prolonged tension often takes the shortest path to find certainty. Light in the fog didn't disappear, it mutated. A struck match was no longer a sharp point of brightness, but a blurred smear bleeding through the air like a wound in the mist. It didn't just trigger those nearby, it affected anyone who believed they were near. The fog made light ambiguous, and that ambiguity made people react more, turning their heads more, shifting their weight more, breathing faster, trying to reclaim control. Ashworth adjusted the tempo. He knew that in fog, less wasn't always more. Instead of isolated signals, he created sequences, not frequent enough to become obvious, but close enough to deny the nervous system any chance to recover. A faint light ahead, another off to the side, then silence. A silence long enough for the brain to ask, did I miss something? And it's in that question that reflex takes over. The biggest shift wasn't in the number of matches, it was in the range of effect. Before, a flash of light might provoke a single reaction. Now, in the fog, it forced entire squads to reposition. Soldiers no longer trusted their stillness to keep them hidden. They began to believe anyone could be watching them through the mist, even if that wasn't true. And once trust in the environment collapsed, discipline became fragile. Ashworth observed this evolution with cold calm. He saw the German sniper network begin to change. Waiting periods grew shorter, micro-adjustments occurred more often. Positions once held for hours were now abandoned early, out of fear they'd been compromised. The fog, rather than concealment, pushed people to expose themselves, simply to feel some illusion of control. During those days, Ashworth fired fewer shots, but each was more effective. Every round didn't just eliminate a soldier, it weakened a connection. When someone was killed in the fog, the rest didn't just lose a teammate. They lost psychological grounding. They began to wonder, was this a personal error, or has the system been read and decoded? And that unanswered question spread fear more powerfully than any warning ever could. The fog also revealed something else: accumulated exhaustion. Reflexes cannot be activated over and over without consequence. Every time the eyes flinch, the neck turns, the body tightens, it drains energy. And when those reflexes repeat dozens of times per day, the body begins to slow. Reactions dull. Decisions blur. And in the Hürtgen Forest, that kind of slowness is a death sentence hanging by a thread. Ashworth didn't need to accelerate the process. He let the fog do its part. All he had to do was place small signals at the right moments, in the right places, and let erosion take its course. It was reverse evolution. Instead of adapting to grow stronger, the system was forced to adapt just to survive. And in doing so, it lost the very qualities that had once made it effective. Absolute stillness gave way to constant hesitation. Light discipline became light obsession. But no system suffers under pressure without eventually trying to rewrite the rules. The Germans weren't blind. They saw that reflex to light was killing them. And when people understand the source of their fear, the instinct is to suppress it. New orders began to circulate. Not official, but whispered, shared in glances. Don't look at the light. Don't turn your head. Don't react. In the fog, these orders sounded reasonable. If light is the trap, avoiding it is survival. But Ashworth understood this wasn't healthy adaptation. It was biological denial. Humans can suppress reflexes for a time, but the price is paralysis. When you refuse to react, you also refuse to perceive. And in an environment where information is already scarce, denying yourself even more awareness is a deadly gamble. The fog, which had once been the variable that amplified Ashworth's strategy, now became the stage for an even greater mistake. When the Germans rewrote the rules, they weren't just resisting the enemy, they were fighting the way their own minds worked. Ashworth didn't notice this change through what they did, but through what they stopped doing. Less movement, less observation, fewer reflexes, and in the Hürtgen Forest, less wasn't safety, it was blindness. When the fog began to lift on a few rare mornings, Ashworth realized the confrontation had entered a new phase. It was no longer a battle between light and reflex, no longer about turning the forest into a circuit. It had become a war between two ways of facing fear. One side embracing reflex in order to exploit it, the other side trying to eliminate reflex, and in doing so, trapping itself in silence. And in the moment the Germans decided to change the rules, Ashworth knew they had stepped onto a faster path to defeat, though they themselves hadn't yet seen it. When the Germans began rewriting the rules, they believed they were reclaiming control. In war, that's a deeply human reflex. When a rule begins to cost you, rewrite the rule. But the Hürtgen Forest wasn't a chalkboard you could erase and rewrite at will. It was an environment where every rule had to pass through the human body before it could take effect. And that's precisely where the German shift began to backfire. The new orders spread quickly. Not written down, not issued formally, but passed through stern looks and whispered warnings. Don't look at the light. Don't react. Don't turn your head. Any soldier who revealed a reflex could endanger the entire team. The intention was sound. Break the behavioral chain Ashworth was exploiting. But in practice, they didn't just cut reflexes, they cut their own ability to orient themselves. He wasn't just ignoring a potential threat, he was ignoring clues that helped him understand his surroundings. Light, even if it was a trap, was still information. Refusing to acknowledge it was the same as blinding oneself. And in the Hürtgen Forest, blinding yourself wasn't bravery, it was slow suicide. Ashworth noticed the shift almost immediately, not through body counts, but through the forest's rhythm. Reflexes that used to fire instantly were now absent. In their place was a strange, rigid silence. Not the silence of confidence, but the silence of someone too scared to move. The forest no longer vibrated with tiny pulses. It felt locked, and that very stillness revealed deadly blind spots. Without reflexive responses to light, the Germans also lost their ability to adjust position in time. Sightlines that used to be fine-tuned constantly were now held too long. Angles that were once subtly rotated became fixed and predictable. And in an environment where light, fog, and terrain shifted constantly, that rigidity turned into vulnerability. Ashworth no longer had to bait reactions. He only had to wait for stillness to become a mistake. Some shots were fired in total silence, without the cue of a match, not because Ashworth abandoned his old strategy, but because it had already done its job. In trying not to see the light, the Germans had placed themselves in a state of selective blindness. They stopped seeing what they needed to see. And when the bullet came, it came from a direction they could no longer anticipate. The irony was that this new discipline only deepened their fear. Every time someone was killed without a visible light source, the survivors grew more convinced that danger was now everywhere, beyond all signals. Light, once the trigger of reflex, became something even more terrifying in its absence. They no longer feared the flicker. They feared the lack of it, because if no light had appeared, what had triggered the latest death? Ashworth understood he was no longer confronting a reflex-driven system, but one actively suppressing its own senses. And such a system didn't need to be attacked directly. It would collapse under the weight of its own accumulated tension. He began shifting his approach, not to adapt to the enemy's new rules, but to exploit the inevitable consequences of those rules. Light was now placed in spots the Germans believed they could safely ignore, off the main lines, in seemingly irrelevant moments. Ashworth didn't need them to look at the light. He only needed them to know it had appeared, to be aware, but forbidden to respond. That contradiction created more pressure than any instantaneous reaction ever could. The brain was forced to hold two opposing states at once, the awareness of threat and the order not to act. The result was a kind of mental paralysis. A soldier knew he might be observed, but wasn't allowed to confirm it. He sensed light at the edge of vision, but couldn't turn to verify. Every passing second stretched longer, heavier, and when time stretches like that, every decision becomes harder. Mental fatigue surged faster than physical exhaustion. Ashworth didn't increase the pressure. He eased it. He left longer gaps between signals. Let fear ferment. Let imagination do the rest. The Germans no longer wondered when the next match would strike. They started wondering if ignoring the light was really keeping them safe. And that question had no satisfying answer, because it went against the deepest layers of human instinct. The change in rules, meant to stabilize the situation, only accelerated its unraveling. Units dissolved faster. Positions were abandoned more frequently. Those who remained grew tenser, less flexible. What had once been a smoothly coordinated network became a scattered cluster of individuals, each trying to avoid mistakes in their own way. And in the Hürtgen Forest, once coordination disappears, death no longer needs to seek its victims. It simply arrives. Ashworth saw the signs of collapse not in the number of kills, but in the quality of response. When a system begins to fear the very signals it once relied on, it has already lost on the deepest level. The Germans weren't just losing tactically. They were losing because they had turned fear into law, and that law had locked them in the dark. And in that moment, something even more cruel began to form. Light, once a trap, once a tool, now became an obsession. It didn't need to appear frequently. The possibility of its appearance was enough. The Hürtgen Forest no longer killed as much by bullet. It killed through a new sensation that crept into every thought, every decision. The fear of light. The fear of light didn't arrive like a sudden panic. It crept in slowly, quietly, like fog soaking through clothes, settling cold against the skin. At first, light was just a threat to be avoided. Then it became a suspicious signal. And finally, it turned into an obsession, a haunting idea that lingered even when no flame ever appeared. Soldiers no longer feared the light because it was there. They feared it because it might appear at any moment. In the Hürtgen Forest, after the new rules had been imposed, German snipers began living in an unusual state of tension. They no longer reacted instinctively, yet they weren't in control either. Every minor change in the environment, a branch shifting in the wind, a pale glint from thinning fog, was instantly processed by the brain as a potential threat. But instead of responding, they had to suppress it. And that suppression didn't disappear. It built up. The human body is not built to endure prolonged states of unresolved readiness. When reflexes are denied their outlet, the nervous system doesn't relax. It trembles, stretches, locked in high alert with nowhere to go. Soldiers began to feel exhausted, not from moving, but from not moving. Not from action, but from the constant pressure to restrain it. And that exhaustion couldn't be seen or measured, but it eroded them faster than any forced march. In that state, light became a symbol. It stood for everything a soldier was not allowed to do. Not allowed to look. Not allowed to acknowledge. Not allowed to understand. Every time they thought of the light, they thought of what they might have missed. And it was that fear of missing something vital that broke their focus. The brain, which depends on input to construct a picture of the world, was now forced to work with growing gaps. Some nights, no match was lit. No strange glow pierced the dark. But those were the heaviest nights of all, because without the light, soldiers didn't know if they had escaped danger, or if danger simply hadn't tested them yet. Silence no longer meant safety. It became a question with no end. And in that silence, imagination stepped in to fill the void. Ashworth understood this transformation deeply. Even if he never had to see a single tense face, he felt it in the rhythm of the forest, in how once steady positions were now abandoned more quickly, in the increasing inconsistency of the few reflexes that remained. The Hurtgen no longer reacted like a confident system. It reacted like a body recoiling in fear, and in that recoil, every movement became clumsier. The fear of light also distorted the idea of the enemy. Before, the enemy was somewhere in the woods, American, armed, hidden. Now the enemy became their own reflexes. Soldiers began to doubt their own eyes, their own senses. Every time they felt the urge to turn their head, to check, to confirm, they had to suppress it. And each time they succeeded, they paid the price, a little more disconnected from their surroundings. They lived, but in a world growing blurrier with each breath. The most brutal truth was that the fear didn't need constant enemy presence to survive. It sustained itself. A whispered story about a man shot for turning his head, a vague memory of light before a teammate disappeared. These scattered pieces fused into a collective belief. Light is a curse, and once that belief was formed, it no longer needed evidence. It lived through memory and imagination. In that context, Ashworth became almost invisible, not because he left the forest, but because he no longer needed to appear in the old way. The war had shifted from the physical layer to the perceptual one. Each match was no longer an action, but a possibility of action. And that possibility was enough to keep the enemy's nervous system in a permanent state of alert. A system like that cannot perform efficiently for long. The fear of light also eroded trust between soldiers. When a small reflex could mean death, anyone could become a liability. Suspicion crept into every glance, every gap of silence. Soldiers began to wonder, can I trust the man next to me not to flinch? And when trust fades, coordination collapses. The sniper network that once operated like a unified organism now splintered into isolated individuals, each fighting their own fear. At that point, the Hürtgen Forest didn't need to kill many more to be effective. It only had to maintain the unease. Whether light appeared or not, it did its job. If it appeared, it triggered forbidden reflexes. If it didn't, it created informational voids that gnawed at the brain. Either way, the result was the same: fatigue, hesitation, and a slow, irreversible decline. In hindsight, the fear of light wasn't just a tactical phenomenon. It was proof of something deeper about the human mind in war, that power doesn't always come from more force. Sometimes it comes from placing people in a state where their instincts become their enemies, and the rules force them to fight themselves. In the Hürtgen Forest, light did exactly that, not by illuminating the enemy, but by casting light on the limits the human mind was never meant to cross. As the Hürtgen Forest faded into the stream of history, what remained wasn't a tactic boxed neatly into a textbook, nor a formula that could be copied and reused. What remained was a strange void, an unspoken space where people sensed something deeply important had occurred, but were reluctant to name it, because naming it would mean accepting an uncomfortable truth, that human beings can be defeated not because the enemy is stronger, but because the very rules they trusted turned around and betrayed them. The story of the 48 matchsticks isn't taught in military academies the way firepower or formations are. It doesn't fit as doctrine because its nature resists any form of standardization. The moment you make it a rule, it dies. The moment you write it into a manual, the enemy learns to avoid it. What made it effective wasn't the match itself, but how it tapped into a universal human reflex in an extremely specific context. And that context can't be perfectly recreated. William Ashworth didn't leave behind a clear legacy of medals or recorded victories. He left behind a way of seeing, a way of understanding. Perhaps that's why this story is so rarely told in full. It doesn't deliver the familiar feeling of glory. There are no clear-cut moments of heroism. Instead, it raises uncomfortable questions. Its collapse becomes inevitable. The final image of this story isn't a gunshot. It isn't a flame. It's a silent forest, still once again, where daylight filters through the trees and no one reacts. The 48 matchsticks have long since burned out, but their echo remains, a quiet reminder that war doesn't just happen on maps or in reports. It happens in the mind, in the nervous system, in those brief moments when humans must choose between instinct and command. If this story feels familiar to you, if you believe the lessons of the Hürtgen Forest still hold meaning in how we understand conflict today, share your thoughts in the comments below. History isn't meant to be observed from a distance. It's meant to be questioned, debated, and used to understand ourselves better. And if you'd like to keep exploring the untold stories of war, the hidden corners where thought and fear shape the outcome, don't forget to subscribe to History War so you never miss an episode. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.